This week we're continuing our look at the boat stories from Mark's Gospel. So just a reminder, what we mean by this is that the boat is the collection of people who are following after Jesus, who've made their commitment to him. And so they are that group of people with Jesus in their midst. And so when Mark refers to the boat serves as a metaphor for the church. And these stories about what happens in the boat help us understand what the church is meant to be about. And so today we're going to look at a very familiar story to many people, but maybe we're going to look at it in a way that we've never considered it before. So we're going to look at Mark chapter 6, verses 30 to 44. The feeding of the 5,000. So read along with me. The apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all that they had done and taught. Then, because so many people were coming and going that they did not even have a chance to eat, he said to them, "Come with me by yourself to a quiet place and get some rest." So they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. But many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When Jesus landed and saw the large crowd, he had compassion on them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. By this time it was late in the day, so the disciples said to him, "This is a remote place," they said, "and it's already very late. Send the people away so that they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." But he answered, "You give them something to eat." They said to him, "That would take more than half a year's wages. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat?" "How many loaves do you have?" he asked. "Go and see." When they found out, they said, 5. And 2 fish. Then Jesus directed them to have all the people sit in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people. He also divided the 2 fish among all of them. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish. The number of the men who had eaten was 5,000. Now, just to put this story in a little bit of context, because a little bit of time has passed since what we covered last time, the disciples have been sent out on a ministry and teaching tour. So Jesus has sent them out in twos to go out to different places to teach about the kingdom, to heal the sick, to cast out demons. So at this point in the story, Jesus has been the one doing all the teaching and working all the miracles, and the disciples have been bystanders. But at this point, things change. Jesus sends them out, and they start doing miraculous things. I'm sure coming back, they have a lot to talk about and a lot to process, because this is a really new phase in their ministry. But what's more, some bad news has showed up. Now, some of Jesus' disciples were disciples of John the Baptist before they followed Jesus. He was their previous rabbi, if you think about it that way. And John the Baptist, is Jesus' cousin. And news has just reached the disciples that John the Baptist has been put to death by Herod. And so I'm sure there's a lot of grieving that needs to happen. The disciples are, I'm sure, saddened by the loss of someone that they knew, and also deeply saddened by the injustice of it, that Herod would put together a righteous man for speaking the truth. And so they have a lot of emotional need that they need to process. So a getaway sounds like a great idea. And of course, this story also says that the reason that they need to get away is that they don't even have time to eat. Now, given the situation that they're in, it seems like an odd observation. There are other things that you might think would be more pressing about why they need to get away, but try and keep that in the top of your mind as you consider this story. So the disciples need a well-earned break because they're so busy, and Jesus suggests a retreat. And as we looked at last week, when we have plans about ministry or about mission, those plans easily and often go off the rails because in God's kingdom, the needs of real people take precedent over the plan. And this happens again this week. Here they land on the beach that's supposed to be deserted so that they can get away and spend time in prayer and discussion. And it's a zoo when they land. I'm sure they were quite disappointed. Now, when Jesus starts teaching the disciples, they're getting antsy. For one, legitimately, it's late in the day, and there's not a lot of food around. I think maybe the disciples are really just wanting to be left alone, and the idea of sending the crowd away seems like a convenient excuse. We're only interested in their self-interest, or in their well-being. But of course, in a subsistence agricultural place, they're not going to have much luck trying to wander around in the barren wilderness looking for villages and farms to buy food where people just basically grow enough food to feed their families. And so maybe they're just really wanting to go back to the plan and trying to come up with an excuse. But this is where Jesus blows their mind. Instead of saying, yeah, I see what you're saying. Let's go send them off to the McDonald's down the road. Oh, wait, no, maybe not. But he says, you feed them. And at that point, the disciples are like, oh. Anybody here ever feel like they're stretched too thin? Like they have too much that they have to do, and then somebody dumps something else on top of them? Anybody ever experienced that before? I imagine we probably all can relate to that. And it's easy for us to think that that's what Jesus is doing. These people are already run ragged, and here he is saying, you feed 5,000 people. But that's not what Jesus is doing, despite the fact that they probably think that at first too. Jesus is taking their meager resources, 5 loaves, 2 fish. If we read John's gospel, it suggests that this is some kid's lunch, and he's making it enough. The disciples, who had no time to eat, are serving a feast. And in the process, Jesus is meeting their needs too. Now, practically, they only have 5 loaves and 2 fish between them, which they got from a kid. That seems to suggest that they've come to this place without any food of their own. So they were going to bump into that problem sooner or later as well. They need food. And Jesus provides enough for the crowd and for them. Even if they didn't serve themselves while they were handing out baskets and baskets and baskets of food, which you could kind of expect that they would have. There are 12 baskets left over, and there are 12 of them. So there is a good-sized meal for each one of them left over afterwards if they haven't already filled themselves to the gills. But more than that, Jesus is also meeting their emotional and their spiritual needs. This story is one of very few stories before the Passion that finds itself in all 4 Gospels. Now you can imagine any person who walked with Jesus remembering certain stories as highlights. And that's why there's a level of variation among these 4 accounts of Jesus' life. But this one account was so important that everyone who was there and wrote about it felt the need to talk about it. That suggests that this is a critical moment in their life. So how did these disciples feel after participating in this miracle? Were they begrudging what Jesus had asked them to do, or were they exhilarated for having participated with Jesus in this amazing act of provision for the people? So Jesus here is meeting the physical needs of his disciples, and he's meeting their emotional and spiritual needs. You could say that the whole plan for the retreat has been thrown off the rails, but Jesus isn't saying, we'll get to the retreat, just let's do one more thing first. Instead, Jesus uses the situation in which his disciples find themselves as an alternative way of providing for their needs, one that demonstrates to us how sometimes The hungry and tired disciples find their deepest needs being met in serving alongside Jesus. And of course, if these disciples are the church, that's true of us too. Now, this story has further symbolic meaning that becomes apparent as we read more in Mark's Gospel. If you read at the end of Mark's Gospel, we see the story of the Last Supper, in which Jesus takes bread, gives thanks, breaks it. Is this looking familiar at all? And he says, "This is my body given for you." In other words, Jesus is drawing a direct comparison. He's trying to help them understand the symbolism that he meant in the first miracle in the Eucharist, in which he explains that he is the bread. His body broken, his act of self-giving love for other people is the feast that he gave out to the other people. And so here we see the church's role is bringing the broken Jesus to the world, serving Jesus to people. Now, it's important to remember this is an act of cooperative service. Just as Jesus doesn't snap his fingers and fill everybody's bellies in the wilderness when he feeds the 5,000, he cooperates along with the disciples, allowing them to make a meaningful contribution, but doing for them what they could not do for themselves. So the disciples can be said to be feeding the crowds Jesus, the broken bread. Now the church then is meant to serve Jesus to the crowds to eat. And in the process of doing so, it finds its nourishment. So what does it look like when we serve Jesus to others? Well, I think we do this by testifying to what Jesus has done. Some of this is in words. We tell people what Jesus did in the Bible stories, what Jesus did on the cross especially, but also what Jesus has done in our own lives. Not just about how Jesus died on a cross, but how that dying on the cross set me free, how it's changed my life, how it's saved me. But it's not just in our words, it's also in our actions. If we proclaim that Jesus saves and Jesus transforms, and then we live lives that demonstrates that salvation and transformation, then we give credit to the message that we share. If, on the other hand, we tell people that Jesus saves and transforms, but our lives show no evidence of that salvation or that transformation, then we undercut the message that we share. And so we are meant to embody this message that Jesus saves, that Jesus heals, that Jesus transforms. And when we do that, we are serving Jesus to the world. But often, we don't serve Jesus to the world, we serve ourselves. Not serving ourselves, but serving ourselves. Here, take a steaming plate of me. When we do this, it creates a toxic meal. It's what happens when the service becomes about us and not about other people. Sometimes this is because we're showing off. We serve in order to show people how pious we are. Look at me, I'm so much better than you. I serve so much more faithfully than you. And it becomes not about Jesus, not about the person we're serving, it becomes about me. Sometimes it becomes an act of striving so that we can measure up. Maybe I feel unworthy to be saved and just feel that if I can serve that much more, Jesus will finally accept me. Or I feel like I'm a spiritual midget surrounded by spiritual giants, but I can compensate for that by being the person who serves all the time. But again, that service isn't about love for people or love for Jesus. That kind of service is about myself. And when I do this, the nourishment that is meant to come from my service doesn't happen. Instead, it leads to burnout, in which case I have to maintain a tempo of service to other people that I simply cannot sustain, especially when my needs are not being met through that because Jesus doesn't bless that kind of self-centered service. It leads to self-righteousness, in which I feel like I'm better than other people, and it leads to feeling owed. That God owes me something because I have served him, or that the people that I serve owe me something, in which case, if that's my attitude, I show that it was never about expressing God's love. My service towards somebody was always meant to be transactional. This sort of service often leads to unhealthy dependencies. The person who has the Messiah complex and feels like if they ever stop serving as much as they do, that this church or this ministry or this group will somehow not work without them. And at the same time, their need to do everything allows others to be complacent, saying, well, all the things are taken care of, so why do I need to do any sort of service? And when that happens, people are robbed of the opportunity to find fulfillment and nourishment in serving Jesus. So, if I think about it, how can I tell whether I'm serving Jesus or whether I'm serving myself to others? Service that flows from Jesus comes from a love for him and deepens my love for others. If you are a parent, you understand that how much you've put into your children's emotional and physical development actually endears them to you more. It's all of that hard work that makes your children into your prize. And now, when you look at them, you want them to succeed. You don't resent them for the hard work that you've caused them most of the time. But you see their successes as your success. You mourn with them in their failures and in their disappointments because you love them. You have become invested in their success. But at the same time, there are other people who we pour into their lives, and the more we pour into their lives, the more we just feel depleted by them, and the more that we can fall into a pattern of resentment. And so if we are serving Jesus to people, then the people that we serve will become dearer to us. We will love them more, care more about their success, care more about their growth. But if we are serving ourselves rather than serving other people, or rather than serving Jesus, then we will feel burned out by serving people, resentful, maybe proud. So what is my attitude towards those I serve? That's the best barometer for understanding if I'm serving Jesus or if I'm serving myself. So if I ask myself this question and I come to the conclusion that I am serving myself, how ought I to respond? Well, the easy thing would simply be to say, well, I guess all that work that I've done in serving, I should just stop. And I'm just going to sit on the sidelines, and when the Spirit moves me and I suddenly feel this love for Jesus, then I'll get back into service if that ever happens. But the thing is I don't think that Jesus just suddenly comes to us and moves us. Well, he might. But maybe this is something in which he calls us to take part. Maybe I should take the energy and the time and the emotional bandwidth that I've invested in serving other people with selfish motives and instead cultivate a closer relationship with Jesus. I think the reason that we tend to serve ourselves rather than serving Jesus is that we sometimes get a little too far away from Jesus. And so it becomes, how can I cultivate a depth of relationship to Jesus? And I would suggest that we do this through the practice of spiritual disciplines. Now, what is a spiritual discipline? A spiritual discipline is not something that I do that means that God owes me something. Instead, it's something that I can do that puts me in a posture to receive from God. And it is because God is good and that God wants us to receive an understanding of who he is, that when we put ourselves in that position, that God faithfully reveals himself to us. Some common spiritual disciplines include prayer, meditation, study, fasting, solitude, silence, submission. It's as we practice these things with an intention of allowing Jesus to speak into our life that we can grow in the depth of our relationship with Jesus and in our ability to lovingly serve others from the strength that he gives us rather than from ourselves. Now, I don't have time to go into all of this, but if you want to know, if you want some starting places to look at in terms of spiritual disciplines, these are two books that I've found really helpful. This is a new one that came out this year or last year called The Deeply Formed Life by Rich Velotus. And this one is a classic that came out in the 70s. It's called Celebration of Discipline. Both of these books are great places to start if you're looking to get into the practice of spiritual disciplines as a way of spiritual growth. So as we grow in the depth of our love for Jesus, service becomes more of a joy and less of an obligation. And that's why the disciples found this action rewarding rather than oppressive, because they were close to Jesus and they were able to serve alongside him, and it's the same for us. There are times, in my own experience, where I've found serving other people to be a joy. Sometimes it's like I receive something and say to God, can I give this to somebody else? And God, of course, says, no, you're being too generous. No, God's never told me that I'm being too generous or anything. He says, of course. And it's like, God rejoices in it and I can rejoice in it, and it is a joy. And there are other times where it's not so much a joy. There are times, for instance, where somebody lays on a guilt trip. Have you ever had somebody come and say like, oh, this mission trip isn't going to happen, or this person, something's not going to happen that needs to happen unless you give money, and you're like, oh, I just feel like I have to, but I don't want to. This isn't something that I do from joy. This is something that I do out of a sense of obligation, and so we give, but we feel guilty about it. God wants us to experience serving as the former and not the latter. So Jesus gives us these things to do, and he's not trying to make our walk with him more onerous. It's easy for us to see Jesus perhaps like some sort of corporate CEO who decides that he wants to squeeze every last drop of productivity out of his workers, and so he oppressively increases their workload over and over and over again until they scream out in protest. That's not what Jesus is up to. Instead, Jesus asks us to walk into something that might at first appear difficult, but if we engage with him in it, we may find that it is actually liberating. That's why Jesus says that his yoke is easy and his burden is light. So, let us feast on Jesus, because I believe that if we do, we will find that he truly satisfies.